fantasies of this kind, and therefore is willing to support military force in self-defense. And if you believe those things, it really is self-defense. So that's it's kind of like a textbook example of aggression with the purpose of extending the scope of further aggression. So once the easy case is handled, you can move on to think of harder cases. Those are the main reasons why so much of the world is overwhelmingly opposed to the war. I mean, it's not just the attack in Iraq. Many people at least perceive it correctly as exactly the way it's intended, as a firm statement that you had better watch out, we are on the way. That's why the United States is now regarded as the greatest threat to peace in the world by a large number of people, probably the vast majority of the population of the world. So George Bush has succeeded within a year in converting the United States to a country that is greatly feared, disliked, and even hated.
At the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre in late January, you described Bush and the people around him as, quote, radical nationalists engaging in, quote, imperial violence. Is this regime in D.C. substantively different from previous ones?
Well, it is useful to have some historical perspective. So let's go to the opposite end of the political spectrum, the Kennedy liberals, about as far as you can get. Okay. In 1963, they announced a doctrine which is not very different from Bush's national security strategy report. Here it is, and the timing is critical. This was in 1963. Dean Acheson, a respected elder statesman, senior advisor to the Kennedy administration, delivered a lecture to the American Society for International Law, in which he instructed them that, in his words, no legal challenge arises in the case of a U.S. response to a challenge to its position, prestige, or authority. Now, what was he referring to? Well, he was referring to the U.S. terrorist war and economic warfare against Cuba. And the timing is quite significant. This was shortly after the missile crisis, which virtually drove the world to the edge of nuclear war. And that was largely a result of a major campaign of international terrorism aimed at what's now called regime change, a major factor that led to the missiles being sent close to nuclear war. Right afterwards, Kennedy stepped up the international terrorist campaigns, and Acheson informed the Society for International Law that we have the right of preventive war against a mere challenge to our position and prestige, not even a threat to existence. I mean, his wording, in fact, was even more extreme than the Bush doctrine last September. On the other hand, to put it in perspective, that was a proclamation by Dean Acheson. It wasn't an official statement of policy. And it's not the first or the last, but this one last September is nevertheless unusual in its brazenness and in the fact that it is a formal statement of policy, not just statements by high officials.
A slogan that you no doubt and we've all heard at peace rallies is no blood for oil. And the whole issue of oil is often referred to as the driving force behind the U.S. attack and occupation of Iraq. How central is oil to U.S. strategy?
Well, it's undoubtedly central. I don't think any sane person doubts that. The Gulf region is the main energy-producing region in the world. It has been since the Second World War. It's expected to be at least for another generation. It's a huge source of strategic power, of material wealth, and Iraq is absolutely central to it. It's the second largest oil reserves, very easily accessible, cheap. To control Iraq is to be in a very strong position to determine the price and production levels, not too high, not too low, to probably undermine OPEC, and to swing your weight around throughout the world. I mean, that's been true since the Second World War. It has nothing particular to do with access to the oil, and the U.S. doesn't really intend to access it, but it does have to do with control. So that's in the background. If Iraq was somewhere in Central Africa, it wouldn't have been chosen for this test case. So that's certainly there in the background, just as it's there in less crucial regions like Central Asia. However, it doesn't account for the specific timing of the operation, because that's a constant concern.
You've often cited that 1945 State Department document on Middle East oil, calling it, quote, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, unquote. The U.S. Does import quite a bit of its oil, 15% from Venezuela. It also imports oil from Colombia and Nigeria. All three of those states are, perhaps from Washington's perspective, somewhat problematic right now, with Hugo Chavez in control in Venezuela and serious internal conflicts, literally civil war in Colombia and uprisings in Nigeria, threatening oil supplies there. I mean, what do you think about all of those factors?
Well, yes, that's very pertinent, and those are the regions where the U.S. actually intends to have access. The Middle East it wants to control. But at least according to intelligence projections, the U.S. intends to rely on what they regard as more stable Atlantic Basin resources. Atlantic Basin means West Africa and the Western Hemisphere, which are more, totally under U.S. control than the Middle East, which is sort of a difficult region. So the projections are control the Middle East, but access the West Basin, including the countries you mentioned. It does therefore follow that lack of conformity, disruption of one kind or another in those areas is seen as a significant threat, and it's a good possibility that, there is very likely to be another episode like Iraq if this one works the way the civilian planners at the Pentagon hope. If it's an easy victory, no fighting, establish a new regime, which you'll call democratic, and, not too much catastrophe and so on. If it works like that, they're going to be emboldened on to the next step. And the next step you can think of several possibilities. One of them, indeed, is the Andean region. The U.S. has military bases all around it now. There are military forces right in there. Colombia and Venezuela are both, especially Venezuela, are substantial oil producers, and there's more elsewhere, like Ecuador and even Brazil. Another possibility is Iran.
Indeed, Iran. The U.S. administration was advised by none other than that man of peace, Ariel Sharon, to go after Iran the day after they finish with Iraq. Well, what about Iran, a designated axis of evil state and also a country that has a lot of oil?
Well, as far as Israel's concerned, Iraq has never been much of an issue, considered a kind of pushover. But Iran is a different story. Iran is a much more serious military and economic force, and for years Israel has been pressing the United States to take on Iran. Iran is too big for Israel to attack, so they want the big boy to do it. And it's quite likely that war may already be underway. A year ago, over 10% of the Israeli Air Force was reported to be permanently based in eastern Turkey, that is, in these huge U.S. military bases in eastern Turkey, and are reported to be flying reconnaissance over the Iranian border. In addition, there are reports, credible reports, it's hard to get the details, that there are efforts, the U.S. and Turkey and Israel are attempting to stir up Azeri nationalist forces in northern Iran to move towards a kind of a linkage of parts of Iran and Azerbaijan as one of their, kind of an axis of U.S., Turkish, Israeli power in the region, opposed to Iran, and ultimately perhaps leading to the split up of Iran and maybe military attack, although there will be a military attack only if it's taken for granted that Iran would be basically defenseless. They're not going to invade anyone who can fight back.
Well, with U.S. military forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq, as well as bases in Turkey, Iran is literally surrounded now.
right.
by U.S.
All through Central Asia, too.
And through Central Asia and the North might not